further ado, I'm going to read the description of the plenary and give you an introduction to our speakers for the evening. Given the disintegration of traditional social democratic parties, 2015 saw the rise of novel political formations such as Syriza and Podemos. 2016 has seen the rise of the Corbyn leadership, the Labour Party, and the mass support for Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Party. This panel seeks to address the project of social democracy today, both in light of these new political formations and the long history of social democratic politics on the left. Once a global movement for the self-emancipation of the working class based on a Marxist revolutionary politics, today's social democratic parties have fully substituted the task of organizing workers in order to overthrow capitalism with the task of creating and maintaining the conditions for a more just market economy. The present standpoint of social democracy is society as it is, bound by national economies and mediated by nation states. Social democracy today promises to fight social injustice in the name of the people, but it no longer promises to realize socialism. Yet what remains is the name, and with it the promise and the problem of social democracy. The following are the questions that we raised for our panelists that they will be addressing in their introductory remarks. Is social democracy still a project for the left? While social democracy arose in the late 19th century as an expression of working people's political demand for socialism, it came into a series of crises over the course of the 20th century. How have these crises transformed the way in which the left understands both historical social democracy and current social democratic political formations? Have these transformations, whether revisionist disputes in the 1890s to 1900, the support of national governments in World War I, the dispute around the Russian and German revolutions of 1917 to 1919, the new left of the 1960s, the crisis of the 1970s, the Reagan and Thatcher neoliberal turns of the 1980s, the emergence of third-way politics in the 1990s, or the economic crisis of 2008. How have these meant the death of social democracy? Has the meaning of social revolution and socialism changed for the left, given the changing definition of social democracy? How, if at all, could the trajectory of social democracy shed light on tasks yet to be achieved on the left today? So we're going to have the order of speakers. I'm going to read their biographies in the order of speakers. They're not sitting in the order that they're going to be speaking. So first one to speak is Jason Schulman, right here. Jason Schulman is a co-editor of the Socialist journal New Politics and the editor of Rosa Luxemburg, Her Life and Legacy. His newest book is Neoliberal Labor Governments and the Union Response, the Politics of the End of Laborism. He teaches political science at St. Francis College. Next in the order is Christoph from the IBT. Christoph is a supporter of the IBT, the International Bolshevik Tendency. He's politically active in Germany, Britain, and the United States. He's also on the editorial board of 1917, which is the IBT journal, and which you can get at our table. Third is Brian Tokar. And Brian Tokar is a lecturer in environmental studies at the University of Vermont, past director and continuing board member of the Institute for Social Ecology. Author of several books on environmental politics and movements, most recently the title of Towards Climate Justice, and he's a co-editor with Fred Magdoff of Agriculture and Food in Crisis. Last but not least, we have Bill Pelz. He has a new book coming out. It's called The People's History in Modern Europe, and it's by the University of Chicago Press. It'll be out in June. You can find out more about it over there at our table. He's also the director of the Institute for Working Class History. Okay, we are going to have a 12-minute introductory presentations. You'll look at Divya she's right here, for time limits. She'll give you a sign at 2, and then she'll do this and you're done. And I'll remind you by knocking on the table. You'll then follow up with a 3-minute exchange. You can respond to one another, and that will be followed up by Q&A. All right, thank you very much, Jason. Please take it away.
Is this a good volume? Is this a good volume for everyone?
It's sort of, a little louder.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, I'll be speaking into the microphone. Okay. I think we need to make a very clear distinction between social democracy as meaning the part of the historical workers' movement, the parties traditionally based on the working class, all of which, for most of their existences, have had commitments to nationalism, to their own specific nation states, to the constitutions of their respective capitalist states, and which more often than not have sought to ally with sections of their capitalist classes, even in government through cross-class coalition governments. I think, for example, right now in Germany, the grand coalition between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. And then there's the other meaning of social democracy as a set of government policies of universal entitlements, which have been most fully accomplished in the Nordic countries. Policies such as universal health care, elder care, child care, gender-neutral family policy, generous sick leave, etc. Two distinct meanings. The great irony today is that it is now only possible to achieve what most would call social democratic reform if we embrace a politics that's far more radical than traditional social democratic reformism. Electoral campaigns and trade union collective bargaining and grievance procedures, important as those are not a substitute for mass social disruption and disorder through strikes, demonstrations, civil disobedience, etc. Furthermore, there is simply no way that our focus as socialists can be purely national in character. I think the real difference between Marxism and social democracy is not that Marxists reject economic or political reform. That was almost never the case. But that we see our main task as strengthening workers' struggles and workers' organization by working to delegitimize the existing state order through which the capitalist class rules, by exposing its corrupt and oligarchic character and proposing a different type of political order of extreme democracy through which the working class rules. I think many people have seen the difference between social democracy and Marxism or revolutionary socialism generally as centering around gradual change versus very quick change, or about nonviolent change versus violent change. This is the sort of thing you learn about in political science textbooks and such. Now, I think everyone here would agree that it is impossible to move beyond capitalism without winning over the vast majority of the rank and file of the armed forces in capitalist states well in advance of thinking we can take power in the real sense. That said, I don't think, at least in the United States and probably in many other countries, I don't believe it's possible any longer to imagine an armed insurrectionary road to socialism, given that so many actually existing bourgeois democracies are so heavily armed. This is simply to comment on the fact that, yes, the capitalist state is not class neutral. Social democracy essentially said, yes, it is, from Edward Bernstein onward, but it is not the case. It never has been. And therefore, yes, it should be dismantled, it must be dismantled here and everywhere else, and replaced by a genuinely democratic republic. Needless to say, this is not anywhere on the agenda of any existing social democratic party, most of which don't even promise to extensively reform capitalism any longer. Most social democratic parties, regardless of their sociological makeup, in government are effectively the left wing of capital. Certainly, the parties assembled in the so-called Socialist International are the left wing, effectively, of capital, and there's really not that much to say about most of them. But I will talk a bit, because Jeremy Corbyn and his leadership of the British Labour Party was mentioned, I will talk a bit about what's happening with the British Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn is a rather principled left-wing social democrat, and his political program is far to the left of now-departed Labour leaders like Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and Ed Miliband. But just because we now have what you might call a real social democrat or a traditional social democrat at the head of the British Labour Party, this does not mean that a return to the glory days of reformism with reforms, a new 1945, if you will, is assured even if Corbyn leads the Labour Party to form a government in 2020. Despite inevitable capital flight, a Corbyn-led Labour government might be able to renationalise the British railways, nationalise the energy sector, fully fund the National Healthcare Service, and end the privatisation of the NHS. It might be able to remove anti-trade union laws, and it might make UK taxation rates more progressive. I think that's about the full extent of what a Corbyn government could do, even if there's significant social unrest that emerges in Britain during the time in which a new Labour government is formed. Those expecting more radical policies, say expropriation and public ownership of the banking system and high finance, are going to be disappointed. I don't think that that's on his agenda, and won't be on his agenda unless something drastic happens which makes it possible. Furthermore, even though the UK is not in the Eurozone and is therefore able to control its own currency, unlike Greece, Corbyn himself has described himself as a deficit hawk. And his desire to rebalance Britain away from financial services, even as the UK is still a special tax haven, involves continuing to greatly subsidize British productive industries. And the problem is that as the head of a capitalist nation state, committed to a fundamentally national project of reform, and the national part is really the most important, Corbyn has no choice but to engage in such policies. British industry, as it is unable to compete, quote, fairly, unquote, with the cheap labor and favorable conditions of business that are available to global capital in the global south. So, and this goes directly against, I think, Corbyn's own desires. The result, at best, would be to export British unemployment and poverty elsewhere. And that is not consistent with Corbyn's own avowed commitment to socialist internationalism. So if he wishes to avoid those sorts of unprincipled outcomes, Corbyn will have to adopt a far more radical and international strategy. Basically, to advance social democratic reform in Britain, he'll have to stop being a social democrat. Or, if you want to put it a different way, more of a social democrat in the 1890s sense of that term, pre-revisionist controversy. He and his ideological counterparts in Europe and elsewhere really have no choice but to do the hard work of constructing a genuinely socialist, anti-capitalist international, something different from the current dying so-called socialist international, made up of parties with genuinely radical and internationalist principles that will work together on projects across nation-state borders. Something which at least would live up to the Second International at its best moments, but going beyond the mostly symbolic internationalism that characterized the Second International before World War I. The simple fact is that capitalism is international. Working class organizations have to be just as international in practice, not simply at the symbolic level. Otherwise, and this would be the greatest tragedy of all, given the current ecological crisis, which gets worse and worse every day, socialism itself is a pipe dream, much as the traditional social democratic vision of a crisis-free, nice capitalism has proven to be a pipe dream. Thank you.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the origins of social democracy in Germany, and then in my latter part talk about the US. So social democracy has its roots in Europe, beginning with a program adopted in Eisenach in 1869 by Germany's...
Speak up into the mic.
Okay. How's this? Is this better? Okay. So, in 1869, Germany's Social Democratic Workers' Party, which called for the abolition of class rule in its program and the replacement of the existing wage system with cooperative work. Its goal was to replace capitalism with a system that was not based on the accumulation of surplus value. The party later renamed itself the Social Democratic Party and became the leading section of the Second Socialist International, adopting a new program in Erfurt in 1891 that contained no explicit demands for proletarian revolution. Already the party's practice had become reformist. The struggle focused on reforms such as women's suffrage, the 8-hour day, workers' protection, and the prohibition of employment of children under 14 years. With the outbreak of World War I in August 1914, many of the central leaders of the Second International backed their own ruling classes in the war. The SPD Reichstag fraction voted for the war credits, while the affiliated trade unions had already agreed previously to refrain from striking during the war. So from that point onwards, social democracy had openly turned into a tool in the service of the bourgeoisie, while retaining the organizational links with the working class. Social democracy never took root as a mass phenomenon in the United States. As one historian of early American Marxism observed, class struggle in America before the Civil War could not develop along simple capital versus labor lines. Despite the fact that the US has been home to a large industrial working class for more than a century and a half, class consciousness has often proved transitory and elusive. And you might wonder why. The relatively democratic traditions of the government in the States, as well as westward expansion, were safety valves that stunted the development of sharp class antagonisms. Policies of ethnic cleansing directed at the indigenous population and war with Mexico also served to generate an identification between the rulers and the ruled, who hazarded their lives in these battles but also stood to reap direct material benefits. Also key were the divisions within a working class between English-speaking American workers and the later waves of immigrants. Donald Trump is only the latest in a long line of demagogues to scapegoat foreign-born workers as the source of economic and social insecurity for the native-born. But most significant of all has been the role of racism, and of course we talked about it in a previous panel, particularly anti-black racism. It played an element of social control. As Marx observed in Capital, labor in the white skin can never be free so long as labor in the black skin is branded. In early colonial America, there were many forms of unfree labor, including indentured servitude of white laborers and captive Native Americans, as well as imported American chattel slaves. The ruling class became alarmed by the prospect of an alliance between white indentured servants and African slaves, and utilized explicit racism as the main strategy for dividing the working class. From colonial times onward, the white working class has been imbued with a false consciousness. While the relative benefits of whiteness are undoubtedly real, the price of this racism was a lowering of living standards of all, as racism in the working class has helped bosses to break strikes, divide workforces, undermine union solidarity, and otherwise reinforce control. And I already talked in a previous panel about how the Socialist Party and the IWW grappled with this problem so I'm not going to repeat this here. Apologies to those who weren't there. But obviously, these divisions served only the interests of the bourgeoisie in building a barrier to the creation of a mass working class party in America. And this brings us to my favorite topic of this talk, Sanders. So the current presidential race, where we have the main contenders representing the twin parties of US imperialism, and there's no working class alternative in sight. On February the 10th, the day after the landslide victory of Bernie Sanders in the New Hampshire primary, the New York Times described his triumph as a remarkable rebuke to the political establishment. And some progressive pundits have speculated that socialism is making a comeback. Bernie Sanders has been, alongside Donald Trump, a center of attention and debate over the last year. It is undeniable that he has helped to popularize the term socialism, especially among young people. I think someone else quoted the YouGov poll from January earlier on, which showed that respondents under the age of 30 preferred socialism to capitalism by 43 to 32%. In a country with an established social democratic party, the Sanders phenomenon may well have occurred within that framework. But Sanders is no socialist. And he is in fact campaigning to represent the capitalist Democratic Party. He has no organic connection to the labor movement. In contrast to Debs, who went to prison for opposing the imperialist war machine in World War I, Sanders is openly supportive of American imperialism. He backed the war in Afghanistan and has embraced, albeit somewhat critically, Obama's foreign policy. Sanders has appeal among many young people because he wants to restore progressive taxation and a higher minimum wage, $15 an hour. He advocates free access to health care and higher education, all of which are demands that resonate with millions of workers and students. Excuse me. Yet he does not think that the working class should be organized and mobilized through its own party, not even a reformist one, in order to achieve these and other goals. In fact, Sanders' campaign ultimately strengthens the Democratic Party because he brings the disaffected voters back into the fold. He becomes yet another obstacle to the building of an explicitly working class party in the US. The Democratic Socialists of America, as well as the Communist Party, nevertheless support his campaign. Various supposed Trotskyists are also supporting Sanders' campaign in the hope that it will set off a massive shift to the left. Socialist Alternative, for example, is calling for a massive mobilization of workers and youth to stand up against the establishment's attempt to shut down the movement around Sanders, which it calls a political revolution. This shows Socialist Alternative's willingness to ignore reality. If Sanders does not secure the nomination, his supporters will either support Hillary Clinton or they have to jump ship, perhaps endorse the Green Party. Because the whole thing has occurred within the framework of the Democratic Party, there is no socialist alternative in sight. The Sanders campaign is no springboard to the creation of an American social democracy, let alone a genuinely socialist workers' movement for revolutionary change. For revolutionary socialists, the political consciousness of the working class is key to a socialist future. But such consciousness does not arise spontaneously. It requires political struggle against the existing illusions of the mass of workers by those who grasp the fundamental proposition that the exploiters, the capitalists, and their victims, working people and other oppressed layers, have fundamentally counterposed historical interests. Working within the political machine of the capitalists can never serve to advance the struggles of the working class. That requires the construction of a different machine. In the first place, a political party to fight for working people. Thank you.
Up next we have Brian Tokar.
Thank you. Is this on?
Aaron?
Okay.
Yep.
I want to thank the organizing group from Platypus for inviting me here. It's been a fascinating day, and I look forward to a continuing fascinating discussion for the rest of the evening. I want to talk a little bit more informally, perhaps, about, and I'll try to keep an eye on the time because I have a lot to cover, the political situation in the U.S., the ongoing crisis of the left and our potential role in it, and in the course of that, we'll certainly touch on the questions of social democracy and potential ways beyond it. To speak of social democracy in the U.S. context, as other people have alluded to, is inherently problematic because, of course, we've never had a genuine social democratic party. We've never had a labor-centered party in any meaningful way here in the U.S. Therefore, the dilemma that we find ourselves in is that the touch point for thinking about social and economic changes in the U.S. context remains the New Deal reforms of the 1930s and 40s. So we're confined to a model that goes back 80 years that continues to be the reference point for discussing what the left can and can't accomplish. And at the same time, we have right-wing forces that not only seek to overturn the New Deal, but seek to overturn all of the social progress of the 20th century. It puts us in a very difficult situation. In an immediate response to that, I find myself still very close to a position that Noam Chomsky articulated, along with many others, during the Bush years of the early 21st century, that on the one hand, we need to defend the minimal social progress, sometimes very meaningful social progress of the last 100 years, but be very systematic about understanding their limits and developing movements that can push beyond them. A significant obstacle, as other people have already alluded to, of course, are all of the ways in which aspiring social democrats, if you will, or more realistically, progressive-leaning Democrats have consistently supported neoliberal policies, growth-oriented economics, militarism, and austerity in its many forms. The example that I was going to focus on is that of the dilemma that climate activists have been dealing with in terms of Obama's energy policies. On the one hand, trying to appropriate some of the rhetoric of the grassroots climate movement and articulate a somewhat progressive position in the international context while continuing to systematically support the continuing expansion of the fossil fuel industry. And we can get into some of the specific policies that go along with that. But another example that might be more relevant to this particular discussion that came up in my workshop on social ecology earlier today is the example of the evolution of the Green Party in the U.S. While the current candidate of the Green Party, Jill Stein, in many ways represents the best of green politics, the green movement that she inherits is one that explicitly walked away from an identity of expressing the wishes and the inclinations of social movements and made a very explicit turn in direction in the late 1990s and early 2000s with the Ralph Nader campaigns toward a very mainstream approach to electoral politics. And earlier in the day, I described some of those early struggles at a time when the Greens was functioning primarily as a network of activist locals and was pushed and manipulated and distorted by those with fundamental interest in pursuing a bourgeois approach to mainstream electoral politics to reorient itself in that direction. that brings us to the Bernie Sanders situation. As a Vermont activist for 35 years, I know Bernie Sanders very well and have been engaged in many debates and struggles with him over this entire 35 years that he's been a significant voice in politics. And again, I can get into more details in the discussion, but the few things that I want to emphasize are that from the beginning, Bernie Sanders has been, as Christoph said, very much in the tradition of New Deal progressivism. The only models he has ever consistently pointed to describe the brand of democratic socialism that he claims to speak for is the model of the Scandinavian social democracies. He's consistently been, again, as Christoph outlined, equivocal on the question of U.S. militarism, whereas he has consistently opposed its most extreme excesses, for example, the war in Iraq, other policies promoted by the U.S. military-industrial complex have, for the most part, continued to gain Sanders' support. He's accomplished some important things, raising the discussion, especially around the implications of the extreme state of economic inequality in this country. He's brought that discussion to many audiences in the United States that have previously had no access at all to that discussion. And I think that's an important accomplishment. Bernie is really plays a positive role as a spokesperson for some of those issues. But again, as has been pointed out, there's no focus on the core problems of capitalism, no discussion of the contradictions inherent in private ownership of productive capacity or land, no discussion of meaningful steps toward worker control, no discussion of genuine alternatives to capitalism. And those are fundamental problems of the Sanders campaign that we can get into more detail about as we go on. Probably the best piece of writing I've seen in the last couple of months on the current malaise in the left was what I think is a really important article by Jerome Roos, who some of you may be familiar with, the editor and founder of a website called Roar Magazine, which in my view has been the most articulate voice for the various uprisings that have emerged around the world in the last 5 or 6 years. I think it's a really important website. In his article on the need for a new anti-capitalist politics, Jerome Roos says the following: as the future collapses in on itself and the left's revolutionary aspirations wither on the vine, it is the weakness of our clenched fist and the paucity of our collective imagination, far more than the, quote, natural laws of their invisible hand, that now makes the end of the world appear more likely than the end of capitalism. It has become painfully clear that if the left is to truly chart a way out of capitalist barbarity, it will have to first reinvent itself. And then a few paragraphs on, specifically on the question of social democracy. He says, social democracy, that other great project of the 20th century left, together, that is, with the revolutionary tradition of the 20th century, which he counterposes it to, has not stood the test of time much better. Across Europe, center-left parties that once dominated the national political scene have long since devolved into the servile lackeys of capital and the submissive technocratic handmaidens of the reactionary right. Reduced to the status of junior partners in grand coalitions and European institutions whose overarching vision of the future appears to be one of permanent austerity, social democracy has been so thoroughly hollowed out as to fundamentally undermine even its own prospects of survival. The specter of Pasocification, of course referring to the Greek Socialist Party that has completely been absorbed into the system, not to mention the sad legacy of Syriza, which at its beginnings aspired to be a more genuine expression of social movements. That specter now looming large over most center-left parties. So what Jerome Roos proposes and what those of us working in the tradition of social ecology propose is moving beyond the kind of left populism that maybe in some contexts Bernie Sanders speaks for, toward a new politics, drawing on the inspiring, however limited, insurrectionary movements of recent times, the Arab Spring, Occupy, kindred movements in Spain and Turkey and many other countries, and developing a strategy that fights for reform in a fundamentally non-reformist way, by raising rather than lowering expectations, by articulating demands that we know the system is inherently incapable of satisfying as a way of moving the discussion forward. Embracing existing movements around the world toward reclaiming ideas of the commons, of new cooperative models of economics, movements to steps toward achieving the long-standing goal of a movement of movements on the left, drawing upon the renewed assertion of direct democracy at the local level, but also moving beyond that toward confederations of what David Harvey calls rebel cities, and embracing some of the strategies first articulated in Murray Bookchin's political strategy of confederal municipalism, first articulated in the 1990s and further elaborated in a book of his later political essays that Verso released just last year called The Next Revolution. These ideas, of course, are an important inspiration for the Kurdish movement on the northern border of Syria, which continues on the one hand to be completely under siege by both the forces of ISIS and the forces of the Turkish state, which has always seen the Kurds as a fundamental threat. But at the same time, in this wartime environment, developing a model of what the Kurds call confederal municipalism that I think is an inspiring example of what's possible in the world today. And drawing upon these examples and many others, I think we have the possibility and even the responsibility to genuinely renew the revolutionary tradition for this century and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. And our last speaker, William Pelz.
Okay, I'll try to keep my remarks brief so we have plenty of time for discussion. I just want to make some comments. I'm really quite happy to be here. I thank the organizers.
Okay.
Now can people hear me better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I want to thank the organizers and these excellent presentations by my co-panelists. And I want to sort of approach this a little bit differently. First of all, I think social democracy was a flawed project from the beginning. Although it achieved successes at the time, there's a reason why Marx went around and said, I'm not a Marxist, that much I know. And I think when you look at social democracy, another quote from Marx is very apropos. A remark he made in a different context in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and that is, history repeats itself, the first time is tragedy, and the second time is farce. And I think that's what we see with social democracy. Because I think the fundamental contradiction you have is if you're talking about replacing a political system that's in power, that is to say the capitalist political system, how does one go about doing that? Well, Ralph Miliband, in his sort of classic book, Marxism and Politics, said that, well, there's always been traditionally two different roads. One is the parliamentary road to socialism, and the other is the insurrectionary road to socialism. Now, what are the problems with both roads? Well, the parliamentary road to socialism, as we have seen, tends to lead parties to get into, at best, office, but not into power. The Swedish Social Democrats were able to be in office for the better part of the 20th century, and the best they were able to come up with was a kinder, gentler form of capitalist exploitation, and exporting much of their problems to the third world. You read books about Swedish imperialism and how they played a part as junior partners to the United States and others. So I think social democracy, in its classic 19th century sense, has failed. It has definitely failed if the goal is socialism. If the goal is to have more social welfare programs, if the goal is to have welfare capitalism, if the goal is to be a kinder, gentler America, let's say, as George Bush Sr. once said, then social democracy has a role. And that's not maybe an insignificant role, but it's not necessarily a role that will lead you to actually a fundamental transformation of society. So what about that second road, the insurrectionary road? Well, the insurrectionary road, of course, has led to disasters of its own, right? We can talk about revolutions in underdeveloped countries where there weren't even the material basis to form socialism. But even if you look at the insurrectionary road in a country that might possibly have a material basis for socialism, you have a problem. And that is that the insurrectionary road tends to isolate the most politically conscious from the mass of people, tends to substitute a vanguard for the mass of the population. So you have this sort of strange dialectic, if you will. Social democracy wants to substitute itself for the mass of the working class and reduce them to passive voters. With the insurrectionary road, the danger is that the mass of the population are reduced to either foot soldiers or to people standing on the sidelines applauding. So I think what we need is to consider the failure of social democracy and, frankly, the failure of most insurrectionary projects and try to look of a way to find a way off the horns of the dilemma, a third way. I hate to use that expression because people are going to accuse me of liking Tony Blair or something. But we need a different way of looking at things, a way that can combine the best of both. We don't want to have a situation following classic social democracy and just winding up with people getting comfortable in cushy parliamentary offices and tossing out a few crumbs, nor do we want to romanticize the heroic guerrilla and think we should all go to the hills like Che and Fidel did and march into a city of a collapsed dictatorship, and that's the road. We have to try to think of something beyond that. And it's a classic problem. I don't have any answers, by the way. I don't claim to have a magic bullet or a magic road that would make this work. But I think we need to, first of all, rethink the socialist project in terms of how we would achieve it. And I think one of the things to do is to look for mass actions that would allow the actual population to be involved. I think, for example, the writings of Rosa Luxemburg, the writings on the mass strike, and I think that a way off the horns of this dilemma possibly could be a socialist project that doesn't plan to seize power by military force per se, and doesn't intend to take over office by getting voted in, but rather seeks to mobilize the masses, seeks to try to fulfill Marx's early dictum about the liberation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself, and have mass actions in a potentially revolutionary situation to actually set up something that would be viable, successful, and could stop capitalism and replace it with socialism. One, of course, immediately thinks of the Paris Commune. Now, what's the problem with social democracy, even radical social democracy in the 21st century, concretely? Well, Greece is the perfect example. Here you had a situation of an avowedly radical, if not revolutionary party, Syriza, that was supposedly going to at least stand up to authority, fight against austerity, and they went to the people, wanted the people to give them a mandate to stand up and fight, and when the people gave them that mandate, they thanked the people and then promptly surrendered. Because they knew that to accept that mandate as their basis to be able to fight, they would have to go beyond just fighting austerity. They would have to take on the powers of the capitalists in Europe. They'd have to take on the capitalist-run European Union. And they basically decided, fight for power, that might not work. Stay in office, well, that's appealing. So they decided they'd rather have office than throw everything on a dice throw, a crapshoot, for power. I think you see the same phenomena happening in Portugal, where you see the left bloc and the Portuguese Communist Party supporting the pretty much discredited Portuguese social democracy. Right? You see the same thing, the splits that are happening. People may be following Podemos in Spain, where you have various groups saying that, well, we can't just go ahead and support the discredited socialists, and others are saying, well, we have to be practical. So I think we really have to come up with some way around this dilemma, either these utopian, I think in industrialized countries, certainly utopian ideas that we send fighters up to the mountains of Montana or some such nonsense, versus the idea that if we only just get some good, honest people in government, that'll solve the problem. And that's the sort of the two extremes that you often get. And I think we have to rethink things. Now, I'm not here to say that I've got this theory and I've got this strategy and this will work and you should listen to me. I'm saying what we need collectively is to rethink things. And I think a good model for trying to rethink things is try to think of models that mobilize the people, that keep the people, the masses of the population, particularly, of course, the working class, be they in factory, field, or now office, to get them involved and keep them involved. Because without that, you're going to wind up having an isolated group which can be bought off as successful and crushed if it's not successful. So I think that those are the sort of things we should look at when we talk about the failures of social democracy. That it's not just a matter that we can recreate something which was flawed from the very beginning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to have about 3 minutes each to respond to one another, and let's take it in the same order. Is that okay? All right, so go ahead, Jason.
Okay. In partial response to Christoph talking about why it is that there was never a mass social democratic party in the United States, certainly the issues that he raises in terms of white supremacy and other issues have been brought up numerous times. I want to recommend to everyone a very important book that came out, I think around 2010, by an Australian social scientist named Robin Archer. It's called Why Is There No Labour Party in the United States? It's a very important book which not enough people have read, and what it tries to do, I think pretty convincingly, is to discuss how it is that while many of the reasons that have commonly been given for why there was never a mass social democratic or labor party in the United States, why is it that those problems also existed in some form in Australia, and yet Australia got a Labour Party? In fact, they got the first Labour Party government in world history, if I'm not mistaken. So I very much recommend that book, which dispels certain commonplace assumptions. In regards to Syriza, which both Brian and Bill talked about, I want to very much recommend articles which appeared on the website of the journal I'm co-editor of, New Politics. My co-editor, or actually it's just on the editorial board, Barry Finger, wrote some very important articles on Syriza, and particularly about what it could have done once it came into office, what it could have done during the negotiations, or whatever the proper term would be, with the Troika, that it did not do, that not every single horrible outcome was preordained. And also I would just simply point out that I'm not sure what it would have meant for Syriza, or a more radical version of it, to take power within the context of an impoverished Greece. In the absence of a mass socialist international, I think if one attempted to create a Greek worker state, that state would not last very long. It would be the victim of economic sanctions, and it would fall apart very quickly. And I'm not happy to say that, but that I think is what would happen. Bill invoked Rosa Luxemburg on the mass strike. I think if we want to go back to thinking about strategy, back to a time when social democracy meant something very different than what it means now, there are worse things that one could do than to reread The Road to Power by Karl Kautsky, that was Lenin's favorite book by Kautsky, and also Rosa on the mass strike, the party, and the trade unions. Between those two, as well as I think Gramsci's The Modern Prince, between those three, those are probably the most important books on Marxist political strategy that one could read. And in regard to social democratic reforms or welfare state capitalism, as Bill mentioned, I don't think he was really criticizing anything I said. But I just want to say that I don't believe by any means that social democratic reforms can overcome the capitalist crisis. I don't know of anyone who believes that. That said, if we don't have the class power to win the reforms that have traditionally been associated with the term social democracy, we certainly don't have the power to overthrow capitalist society.
Thank you, Jason. Could we do Christoph next? Yes?
Sure. I'm happy with it. So I don't often agree with Jason, I don't think, but he did say something that I had to agree with earlier in his remarks, and that is when he talked about Jeremy Corbyn and what Corbyn represents. I think you roughly said, he's not all that radical. He kind of stands out because of what had been before, in terms of what the party was like before. And that's more or less. So I'll agree with it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's important because social democracy in the person of Tony Blair or in Germany under Schröder, they have been social democratic formations that went before Corbyn and were actually very busy undoing previous reforms and making it worse for the working class. They made themselves a name by administering austerity measures. In fact, Schröder's government attacked the working class of Germany with a ferocity that probably no conservative government would have dared to undertake, because they would have been scared of the backlash and the fight back by the working class. A social democratic government could do that because the workers still retained some illusions, as misplaced as they were. Some were still thinking of them as their government. So in that contrast, I think the Corbyn types stand out because at least now they don't say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to attack you right away. No, they're not going to say that. They get elected under a kind of soft reformist illusion of maybe we have to kind of do a little bit of softer austerity. Maybe we've gone a little bit too far. We have to slow it down a little bit. Looks like people don't like it that much, austerity. That's why they get elected. I think as to what Brian said in regards to the Greens, I didn't comment on the Green Party partly because I don't see them as a social democratic formation, but I would agree with you that they have undergone a transformation in the US as well as in other countries. Perhaps the longest journey they've traveled is in Germany, where they have become totally integrated and have administered the government and have implemented austerity measures. But I think what is relevant about the Greens today in this country is that they have no organic links with the working class, that their focus is not what the workers are doing, and that their focus really is not how to remove capitalism, but how to make it greener. In their point of view, big capitalists are bad, small local capitalists are good. That's pretty much their program. They are not anti-capitalist at all. And it will be interesting to see how some of the Bernie Sanders supporters who don't want to vote for Hillary will go once there is no Bernie Sanders campaign anymore. I can imagine some will support the Green Party. Some will not, some will drop out, whatever. But certainly the Green Party does not represent social democracy here and has never in any other country. I guess that's probably my time.
Yes, thank you. Brian?
Yeah, I don't have that much to add, except I'll just say a couple of things. The great Italian revolutionary Enrico Malatesta once said, everything depends on what the people are capable of wanting. And that applies to the broad mass of the population, and it also applies to the organizers of left movements. Presidential election years historically have been extremely problematic and demobilizing, I would argue, for the left. In recent memory, we can look at the legacy of Jesse Jackson's campaigns, which aroused tremendous hope on the part of the left in the 1980s, the Nader campaigns, which I already said a little bit about in the 90s, and certainly Bernie Sanders today. In neither of the previous instances did those presidential campaigns really contribute anything tangible, certainly not in organizational terms, but also, I would argue, in mobilization terms, to anything that we would call a strengthening of the left in this country. The Jackson campaign raised the tremendous hope of a rainbow coalition bringing together social forces. The day Jesse Jackson dropped out of the Democratic Party, there was no more rainbow coalition. Unfortunately, our experience with Bernie Sanders in Vermont suggests a very high likelihood that the same thing will happen. And I think the person who's not from Vermont but has articulated this in writing the most precisely is Bill Fletcher, writing on ZNet, who's written on this phenomenon and the comparison between Bernie and Jesse Jackson, and having watched Bernie very closely and fought with him on many issues over many years, one thing that's clear is that he's always taken a very hands-off relationship to the Progressive Party in Vermont, which is a significant force in state politics, which was significantly inspired by Bernie's term as mayor of Burlington, but which he has consistently distanced himself from, and an even more ambiguous relationship with social movements on the ground. So it's really going to be up to those of us who want to see an independent left emerge to go forward from the current situation, because people like Bernie Sanders will never do that for us.
Thank you, Brian. And last but not least, Phil?
Yeah, I think what we have to do is try to win the battle of ideas, put forward counter-hegemonic, if you will, in a Gramscian sense, concepts, while we try to develop a strategy that can lead us forward as we're trying to develop some sort of organic link with the masses.
Is your microphone on?
I don't know. It has a little red light.
It needs to be a green light.
Why don't we just give you the next?
You want to try this?
Oh, that's a green one.
Now I have a green light.
Nope.
No?
Take this one.
Bourgeois technology at its best, right? And they always say it always gives us the best of everything through competition and the free market, right? They can't even get the microphones to work for Trump or for me. Oh, well. What can you do? I was saying we need counter-hegemonic ideas. We have to try to put forward different ideas. We have to have free debate. We have to try to develop a road that can actually move us beyond office holding on the one hand and utopianism on the other. On the other hand, we shouldn't be too modest. We should fight for reforms, but particularly when they mobilize people. I think of the Fight for 15, which has been particularly active and particularly successful. That's something that people can grasp. We need to have reforms like that that build towards people actually thinking the future can be better. Reforms that actually push people to think there is a different reality that can be established. As the famous author of Under Fire, the great anti-war novel from World War I, once said, you have to demand the impossible, because only by fighting for the impossible can you figure out what is actually possible to achieve. And I think that's what we have to do. And I think we too easily sometimes get sidetracked. Like, for example, I haven't talked about Bernie Sanders in the presidential elections, except for my reference there to Trump, is because they're going to be over soon. And win, lose, or draw, we're going to have to deal with whatever reality is given to us, but we can't think in such a short time frame. We have to think of this as a long march, if you will, as something that we have to continue, as a project to try to come up with a new way of building forces and popular support for a socialist project. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to have Q&A. I think I'm going to take 2 questions at a time. And please, if you feel like answering the question, do so. But not every speaker has to answer the question. In fact, we can get more questions in there that way.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
Okay, so 1 hand here, 1 hand there, 2, Richard, then Chris. Richard. Oh, a microphone, I'm sorry. Why don't we use, does that one work?
Does it work? Yeah. Well, I'm going to start by responding to Bill Pelz's comment, because I think it's sort of central to the whole discussion about the 2 roads, which you labeled the parliamentary and the insurrectionary. You could also speak of a German problem.
Louder, Richard.
You could also speak of a German problem and a Russian problem. So I think the elephant in the room on the panel is sort of, the elephant in the room on the panel is, to some extent, the question of Leninism and the Bolshevik Revolution. I obviously know how Christoph thinks about that, but I would be interested in knowing how the rest of you think about that. And again, I just wanted to ask a question really related to this. That's the first part of it. And the second part of the question is Bill Pelz brought up the idea that we need to think of something new. And this is a theme I keep hearing at leftist events. We need to think of new strategies. We need to do something differently. And I've become quite cynical about this, because I have the feeling that really all there is on the left are ideas that are quite old now, and that maybe there haven't been any really new ideas since around 1940 or earlier, and that really what we have is a lot of circulating and retrying of new ideas, and even this new appeal of social democracy is really more about an exhaustion with other forms of identitarian politics. And it's, we work within the same arguments, work within the Democratic Party.
Get to your question.
Anyway, that's the question. The first question is, what do people think about Leninism and the Bolshevik Revolution as models, as historical experience? The second question, are there really any new ideas? Can there really be any new ideas at this point in history?
Thank you. Chris, second question. Chris is back there on the board.
Okay. Actually, Richard sort of asked the question that I wanted to ask, but I will maybe add to it. I was struck by the idea that there has never been a mass social democratic or socialist party in the United States, because of course there was, namely the Socialist Party of America before World War I. Certainly bigger than anything that's come subsequently. And so I maybe want to raise the question of pre-World War I history. In other words, that rather than naturalizing the 20th century and that experience, which includes the question of Leninism as opposed to maybe Lenin per se, and really ask the question of how the history before World War I fundamentally differs when thinking about these political models from the history after World War I.
Thank you. Okay. Any takers? Any willing takers? Jason?
All right, just to touch on Lenin and his ism. I think that it's foolish the way certain parts of the left demonize Lenin. And I know that sounds kind of funny from someone who is supposedly a social democrat, but I think that the demonization of Lenin by parts of the left is silly. And here I agree with largely and Charles Post and some other figures. I don't think that, as it turns out, Lenin was really such an original thinker as to merit his own ism. So I don't really think that there is such a thing, at least at this point in time, as Leninism. I talk more about this in a review of Paul LeBlanc's unfinished Leninism book in the Current New Politics. As to the Socialist Party, it is as close as we ever got to a mass party. But it was never more than a quasi-mass party. It was never large enough, powerful enough, influential enough to displace the Republican or Democratic parties. That's all I meant. When Robin Archer is asking why is there no Labor Party in the United States, he means something that was large enough, powerful enough, influential enough to displace, say, the way that the British Labour Party displaced the Liberals. That's what he means.
Takers, Brian, I see.
Well, at the risk of sounding silly, I have to say that from where I sit, Leninism represented a fundamental wrong turn in the legacy of the left. The notion of the Leninist vanguard party eviscerated the democratic traditions of the left to a significant degree and represented a simplification of the entire Marxist tradition, both in theoretical and political terms. If you look at some of the recent scholarship going back to Marx's writings on relationship to nature, a much more ambiguous understanding of the role of production and the articulation of a liberatory project, I would argue that this phenomenon that I have increasingly come to characterize as 20th century Marxism, very much influenced by various Leninist currents, represented a fundamental wrong turn. And I look forward, Jason, to reading your review. It might change my mind, but I have a feeling it might not.
I just wanted to underline the second part of Chris's question about the difference between left politics before World War I and after. So maybe.
And also, if there are any new ideas.
Yes, any new ideas? Nope. Takers?
I think there are new ideas. I think the reemergence of a politics from below that is symbolized by the movements of the last half dozen years or so is a significant new direction. It draws on ancient traditions in many ways, but I think it is a significant departure from the failures of left strategy in the last 80 to 100 years.
Christoph?
Just very briefly on the Socialist Party. Of course, the Socialist Party was significant, and perhaps it would have continued to grow, possibly, but really what killed it off was the Russian Revolution. Because what the Russian Revolution did was pose the question of how are we going to sort out this mess? And the Russian Revolution gave a very clear answer. And it meant that the best elements in the Socialist Party really decided to take a different path, and obviously went ahead and founded communist parties. Bolshevism contributed to the demise of the Socialist Party because the Bolsheviks were successful in the revolution. And nothing is more appealing, nothing is more sexy than victory. And that's what the Bolsheviks carried forward. And that's what drew the masses in, including people in the Socialist Party.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to the new idea. That is to say, I think the best way of finding new ideas is examining the history and finding out what worked in the past, what didn't work in the past, what are the dangers of doing things. So, for example, when I said counter-hegemonic ideas, I think that was one of the great successes in the 19th century in the Socialist Party of America and in the SPD and other things, is that they weren't just a political party running in elections. They weren't just theoretical works. They also had singing societies. They also had bicycle clubs. They had red Sunday schools, if you want to call it that. They had a whole range. They had workers' libraries where workers could check out books. In other words, they tried to create, as much as possible, a separate counter-hegemonic world for their supporters. And this was always much, much broader than the party itself. Because a lot of people, I know this might sound really hard to believe, a lot of people just don't care that much about politics. I know, you can't believe that, but it's true. And so you can draw people in and bring them into the orbit and educate them through things that are not strictly political. And I think that that's very important. So, for example, singing societies. That may sound silly, and of course, in the modern context, it wouldn't be choir societies. It would obviously be another form of music as times have changed. But that sort of thing, I think, is very important.
YouTube societies.
Sorry?
YouTube societies.
YouTube societies. But what I was saying about singing societies is, you know, you can have the Chicago Tribune give me, you know, 4 or 5 hot new indie bands that have a big following and recruit them to the left, and we're in business.
All right. I see Nick, and I saw Gregor is here. He had his hand up. No, Jacob. So Nick first and Jacob. Yes, Nick, stand up.
So my question, during the heyday of social democracy, the 1890s, early 20th century, there was an international workers' movement. Today we're talking about reviving social democracy, but we don't have an international workers' movement that's progressing in the same manner that it was back in 1890 in the early 20th century. And you can look at a variety of reasons why that might be. I think some of the more compelling reasons would be that we have international capital in ways that we don't have, that we've never really seen before. And then we also have the complete extension, integration, whatever way you want to characterize it, but basically the Bonapartist state that makes functional collective bargaining almost impossible for trade unions now. You just have such a restriction on the exercise of the right to strike, of the ability to effectively use economic action. I think it was interesting that somebody raised the specter of Fight for 15, which to my mind really isn't an attempt at a strike at all, and it's not really an economic action, but really it's mediated through the state. What Fight for 15 is trying to do is raise some kind of social consciousness to push for a referendum to raise the minimum wage that's completely mediated by the state. It's not economic action. So I guess my question would be, how do you envision reviving social democracy without revival in an international workers' movement? How do you imagine an international workers' movement emerging without a social democratic party that's going to challenge these legal obstacles to some kind of resurgence in worker activity? And do you see it happening through economic activity or through these mediated actions that push for legal reforms? Because that seems to be more effective right now than having these kinds of economic strikes. There's not very many places at all that use the strike to organize workers anymore, even though that historically was how a vast majority of the key industries in America were organized at the heyday of social democracy.
Thank you. And Jacob. Jacob's up here. Keep your hand raised.
Hi. So Gramsci's been brought up twice now, and I think was once previously earlier in the day. But gone unexamined is the legacy of the Italian Communist Party, and then I think to a lesser degree the French Communist Party, which were large enough and distinctive enough that even though they went through a process of Stalinization as a part of their membership in the Comintern, that by perhaps like the 80s, they had, I think, an opportunity to be, self-consciously they tried to chart this sort of third course between the failures of social democracy and the failures of communism on the other hand. And yet they too failed. And I know I'm not going to ask about like sort of the historical specifics of the Italian Communist Party because that's not the topic here, but I am curious if any of you, like, is this a legacy worth examining, or is this just sort of another casualty of a failed 20th century?
Thank you. All right, takers. Brian's looking at me, and then Will. Okay.
Yeah, on the first question, I think we need to embrace working class politics in the traditional sense, but we also need to see beyond it. And I'm speaking as somebody who's intensely involved in trade union work in an academic setting and who feels very strongly in the continuing importance of the labor movement as part of a broader left. But I think at a time when production has both been relocated to authoritarian centers in the global south where workers have almost no ability to organize, and where the role of human beings in the production process has been severely diminished by technology, I think a lot of traditional notions of the inherent power of workers as workers has already been taken away from us. So we need to think much more broadly about people's movements. And the reason I really see the Fight for 15 as a positive example in the broad spectrum of people's movements is not so much about whether or not people succeed in convincing one state or another to implement a $15 an hour minimum wage, although that can be crucially important for the economic well-being of people in those states. But I see it primarily as an effort to organize the unorganized and to organize the lowest paid and traditionally least empowered sector of the working class. And I think that creates an opening to, again, a different way of thinking about the role of labor movements in the broader context of social movements, of people's movements.
Yeah, I want to talk about the Fight for 15 as well. I happen to be fairly familiar with it. The prime organizer in the city of Chicago is a former student of mine, so I have a lot of sort of conversations about this. The plan of Fight for 15, or at least the express plan, is not to try to pressure governmental units into passing laws. If that's a byproduct, that's fine. What they're trying to do is target different corporations, specifically McDonald's in Chicago and the United States, as I understand it, to make them raise their wage to 15, which would then have a bump-on effect for the rest of the fast food industries. And I actually think that places like California and now New York, talking about raising the minimum wage over a period of long years for 15, that's an attempt to head off the spontaneous movement and corral it into legalistic ways. I actually think that they've had a pretty good strategy about not relying on politicians and not relying on legislation so much. Now, on the question of political parties, I think somebody said, well, don't we need a political party? Well, yes, of course we need a political party. It's a question of what type. Question of what a political party does and how it's formed, whether it's very narrow, sectarian, or whether it's just a mailing list. In other words, you have to have something in between. You have to have a set of values you agree on, a set of projects that you can work together on, but you have to allow differences of opinion and so on. Now, just real quickly on the Italian Communist Party and the French Communist Party, I don't think that was a failure in any sense of counter-hegemonic strategies or anything else. I think by the 80s, both parties had firmly adopted the electoral road to power. Their strategy was, we're going to come to power through elections, and therefore they suffered the same sort of problems that you would face from any classic social democratic party. They just replaced the social democrats in their countries as the party of reform that was going to get in, or maybe a little bit left wing of the social democrats.
Jason?
Bill said much of what I would say about it. The PCF, of course, was never in government except as the junior partner to the French socialists in the early 80s, and they didn't stay there very long, nor did they ever fully go Euro-communist. In regards to the PCI, I can understand why people thought that might be, at the time, say in the early 70s, that they might be forging an alternative both to traditional revisionist social democracy as well as to the armed insurrectionary road to socialism. But I think by the time that Enrico Berlinguer was talking about the historic compromise with the Christian Democrats and how they were going to govern together, I think it should have been quite clear that the PCI may have talked like Gramsci, but their politics were fundamentally Edward Bernstein all over again.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think that the comment raised the question of, in the heyday of social democracy, we had mass parties and a Socialist International. We have nothing like this today. Very true. And I guess that means the job is going to be extra difficult. It also means that we are in a situation where perhaps the workers will simply be compelled to take steps in the right direction because there is no other way. If you look at the response of the Greek working class to the crisis that was manufactured to some extent in their country, the response was to go out on the streets, to go on strike, and sometimes bypassing instructions of political or trade union leaders who often wanted to dampen things down. I don't think that's impossible to be repeated in the United States. Sometimes people are compelled to step out of what is perceived as normal, appropriate, or ordinary behavior because they're pushed up against the wall and say, fuck this, no more. We've had it. This is enough. It can happen. It usually is spontaneous. It usually doesn't last very long. It usually doesn't take a very conscious political form, but those outbursts can happen and something can be salvaged from those too. And I think the Fight for 15 is a valuable effort in trying to organize some sections of the working class. To make the Fight for 15 successful, by the way, in my humble opinion, requires actually the transformation of the trade unions, who at this stage are going to be sometimes a little bit of a support and sometimes a little bit of an obstacle. A successful struggle will have to have an impact on the trade unions themselves. It will be a struggle whereby the existing leadership will need to be replaced with a class struggle leadership in order to drive the struggle for 15 forward. So these kind of things are connected, and if they go well, they have a knock-on effect. Unfortunately, we haven't seen this very often, but I can tell you it does happen.
See one hand here, and maybe one in the back. So maybe start with Stefan. Oh, Johnny has a question? I'm sorry, I didn't see him. So why don't we do Johnny and this gentleman here, and then we'll do
Just a quick question. How do you, there's the failure of social democracy before the First World War, but there's also an attempt by the New Left around social democracy, and which seems to be fundamentally different. And I'm thinking about your comments, Brian, about the social movements of the new social movements and the attempt to merge them with social democracy. Do the panelists see that as an opportunity, as a false start? And it seems that the legacy of the New Left and the way that the repetition that Richard's talking about continues to resonate. Is this the only kind of horizon for social democracy? Just to put a finer point on it, there seems to be something more than just aggregating the movements. There seems to be a political dimension, political power, and the role of politics in forming consciousness that is something different from just taking the aggregation of the social movements. How do you, in light of that, how do you assess the potential of the New Left with social democracy, or was it just a false start? Its premises were flawed.
Do you want to be this gentleman up here in the second row?
I just want to start off with a comment. I think sometimes when you ask the wrong questions, it's very difficult to get the right answers. And while Platypus has raised a lot of important questions, I think it's clear to most people that social democracy as a revolutionary idea or force has been dead for a very long time. and so I think it's very difficult to get at things. I think the question that was raised about new ideas is probably the most important thing. Being older, like many people my age, I read Mao, and Mao had this little essay, "Where do correct ideas come from?" He had good titles for a lot of stuff. The short answer in Marxism says historical materialism is what you need to study to develop the correct ideas. And I think anybody who looks at the conditions today with the economic crisis, the transformation of the nature of the working class and unions and things like that, that's where the answers lie, to investigate the economic crisis, the nature of the working class. And I think the concrete reality, I'm kind of happy that most people on the left stay away from the Bernie Sanders campaign. Because here we have hundreds of thousands of people in the streets and in motion. And it's not good enough for the left. What the left and what revolutionaries do is they move among the masses and they organize revolution.
Could you get to your question? Thank you.
So, the question is, could you guys comment on why somebody who's a revolutionary would stay away from hundreds of thousands of people? Bernie isn't the Lenin. We are. We're supposed to be moving amongst those people.
Thank you. Yes.
So if I understood the comment correctly, you're asking why Bernie isn't connecting with the masses who are actually in motion?
No, why the revolutionaries like you guys are not connecting with the masses.
Oh, why we're not connecting? Well, because we haven't invited a platypus panel. I guess I'll answer as best as I can. Connecting with the masses as a mass of people is usually only possible if you have a mass party. While you don't have a mass party with masses of people who all march in the same direction, you are reduced to a smaller audience, sometimes even smaller than the one we have today. And that is because you tend to focus on the people who have a relatively high consciousness, who have already grasped some of the ideas, who can connect to what is objectively necessary, who you can have a conversation with where people don't just shake their head and walk out after 1 minute. People might say, yeah, I have thought that before, that's not a bad idea. You connect with people in smaller circles, mainly during times when the class struggle is low. I think the Russian Emancipation of Labor League had a total of 8 people at their founding conference. That probably didn't make for a very good party afterwards, but what it did make for was the starting point for a movement and for an organization that 40 years or so later took power in Russia through some transformations. At the beginning, you start with a very small group of people. And at the beginning, the arguments and sometimes the faction fights over which program is correct and which course to take is extremely important. And Lenin was very good at that. He would sometimes agonize his own comrades over what seemed like minor points. He thought they were very, very important. And he stuck to his guns. And that's why, would we like to connect with the masses? Yes. But we need to build an organization that can grow and win the confidence of the most advanced layers of the class first. We can't jump over historical stages. We can't pretend to be able to go to the masses tomorrow and say, follow us, we have great ideas. You've never met us, you never met a single article of ours, you never talked to us, but you must follow us. That doesn't work either. You start with a small conversation with a handful of people and move from there. Do we want to have a mass party? Sure, yes. But I don't think you can say, why don't you connect with the masses? Because look around. The masses didn't come to this forum either. It's a reflection of where we're at the left. We have to be honest about that. And start with tasks and with objectives that are realistic and attainable given the current limited forces. That's how we move forward.
Any other takers?
Yeah, a little bit on Andoni's question, and we spent a little bit of time on this at the social ecology discussion again this morning, and that is efforts to create a political party or social democratic dimension coming out of the New Left. And to some extent, in its early years, the Green parties in various countries aspired to be just that, to be an expression of New Left social movements both inside and outside the system. The notion of the party standing on two legs was the terminology back in the 1980s. And of course in Germany, with the failure of some of the more insurrectionary tendencies in the 1970s, you had the tendency represented by people like Joschka Fischer arguing that what the left needed to do was, quote, take a march through the institutions, and that is embed themselves in the institutions of mainstream society. And what resulted was the Greens, which in its from its earliest years, well, I should say, in its early years, tried to live up to the expectation and the ambition of being a voice for movements, but very quickly became polarized between those people who adopted a strategy of realpolitik, eventually leading to the coalition with the Social Democrats and Joschka Fischer becoming the foreign minister in the 1990s and supporting Clinton's bombing of Serbia, which Bernie Sanders also did, by the way, leading to huge public fights in every city in Vermont, with Bernie defending that position and most of the activists who had historically supported him opposing it. That's a tangent. But and the other tendency describing itself in Germany as fundamental oppositionists seeking for the Greens to continue to be a voice for social movements. Here in the U.S., with the Nader campaigns in '96 and 2000, the Green networks that existed were really completely taken over by those tendencies whose aspiration, as I said earlier, was to be engaged in a very mainstream approach to electoral politics. And in the view of some of the most prominent voices of that tendency, even sought to position itself as against the influence of the left and the Greens. And at that point, most of us who aspired to a more holistic, social movement-oriented strategy walked out because we saw nowhere else to go within that context. And that was really the closest we've had, either in the U.S. or internationally, to political party expression of the New Left. So where that leaves us today is the need to, I think, adopt a very different kind of strategy. The idea of confederations of movements below explicitly aspiring to be a counterpower to ruling forces and to become engaged in politics in a fundamentally different way that defies the norms of traditional party democracy is in my view, a much more meaningful approach right now.
Yeah, I really wanted to speak to that Sanders question. I think that's really an important question. And the question I seem to think is, why hasn't the left managed to figure out some sort of strategy, however tentative, to talk to the Sanders supporters once it's over? Once he's either been denied the nomination, and explain what that says about the way the primaries are set up, the undemocratic nature of the Democratic Party, and so on, or if he somehow became president, why he actually can't really get any of the real socialist ideas through because of the structure the U.S. Constitution imposes upon the government. In other words, take this as a educational moment for people because they're excited by the ideas, right? And I think that's great. And you go in and tell them that, well, Sanders isn't going to do much. He's a Democrat. Oh, if he only ran as an independent, it would be okay. But that's not going to have an impact. What you have to do is see where they're at. They're excited by, for them, a new idea. We're mainly talking about people under 30 or under 40 at most, and try to figure out a strategy of reaching them so that instead of just going back to a sense of being hopeless or apolitical, you say, look, here's why Sanders didn't get the nomination, or here's why Sanders became president, and look at what's happening now. They're not letting him. The permanent deep government, if you want to look at it that way, is not allowing him to even do the minor things he promised to do. That's what we have to think out. How can you reach those people, after the fact?
We are. We're doing that.
I'm going to take some more questions. Anybody else?
Let's maybe take a lot since it's getting late. Let's maybe just hear.
So why don't we take 3 questions?
Let's maybe hear from whoever wants to speak, and then we'll do a last round.
Yeah, there's a lot of people. So why don't we do Stefan? I saw Pam and these 2 folks here. Yeah, let's see how it goes. Maybe we can add you on there, Stefan.
Okay, thank you. I want to link the panel of this title, the death of social democracy, towards the title of our conference, What's Socialism? So Marx was pointing out in the 1840s that it was in fact capitalism that was pointing beyond itself towards socialism. And later it became clear that the Social Democratic Party, which were the political organizational form, which the workers' movement gave itself, were like the conscious factor in history which wanted to deepen and further the tendencies in capitalism which were pointing towards socialism. So my question is our society pointing towards socialism, and in how far? What tendencies should an inheritor of the historical project of social democracy as the subject of bringing about socialism would have to take up?
And here, please raise your hand. Yes, Divya, right here.
Thank you. So, one fundamental difference I could see between...
Stand up, please.
Oh, sure. One fundamental difference I could see between, let's say, like the moment of 1917 and today is the deindustrialization that's happened, in the late 20th century, early 21st century, and we don't have, let's say, an industrial proletariat or anyone, at least in the U.S. But I think there's also been this weird way that, for example, information technologies and kind of like, let's say, Silicon Valley has co-opted the project of social democracy to appear as if they're helping society. There's all, talk of disruption and, Uber offering utopian alternatives, let's say, to capitalism, or making capitalism better. So my question would be, is this simple reformism in the classic sense, and why has the left been unable to critique, let's say, companies like Google or something, which ostensibly are capitalist enterprises to the core, but somehow achieve in giving off this positive societal influence? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take 2 last ones. We have Spencer and here in the front. Spencer?
Yeah, I want to pick up on Nick's and Chris's and to a degree Richard's questions. It seems to me that the problem that we face, to take up Richard first, is not exactly the lack of new ideas. That there's certainly a great deal of practical creativity in terms of how people can respond politically to their circumstances. The issue, I think, is more implicit in what Nick and Chris were asking. Nick saying, well, we're in an unprecedented situation. We're not going to replay the rise of the labor movement. Today, we're in very new circumstances. And yet, at the same time, we're plagued by issues not of the lack of new ideas, but of the lack of historical consciousness. where what interested me in the responses to Chris's question about pre-World War I, post-World War I left is not whether you thought Lenin was a major thinker or not, but that you accepted the premise of the question, which is that the Russian Revolution changed history, right? That is the dividing line. And it's really our incapacity to really put ourselves clearly in new circumstances, right? We're sort of facing them, but we don't know how to quite address the fact that all of the detritus of history is around us in the form of sectarian organizations which relate to the history post-1917 in various ways, or the imagination of a revived New Deal, of a revived social democracy in some attenuated way. And so I guess I'd want to sort of reassert their questions in those terms. What would it mean to draw the line? I guess I missed the banner in front of the table. The left is dead. Long live the left, which we ought to have there. Which is a question of what would it mean in practical terms. Winning the battle of ideas. I think Bill mentioned in terms of turning the corner on a period of sort of ongoing, ever more failed repetitions that not only don't bring the revolution or don't solve all of our social problems, but don't really allow us to see a kind of historical horizon within which that's taking place.
Spencer, last question.
Jason Wright for the International Bolshevik Tendency. I think one of our responsibilities as Marxists and as intellectuals is to be the historic memory of the working class. In a very basic way, that means recognizing the Democratic Party as the graveyard of social struggle and seeing that in what happens with a Bernie Sanders is just a repeat of what we've seen before with Jesse Jackson, George McGovern, Eugene McCarthy. In other ways, you can make predictions that are almost prophetic, like around Syriza, where anyone who's familiar with the history of the British Labour Party and remembers the general strike of the 1920s might know the anecdote of Anuri Bevin, who was a left-wing Labourite, about the fact that struggle wasn't really defeated. It was really surrendered, when the Prime Minister, I believe it was, I don't have the book in front of me, so I'm trying to remember, but calls in leaders of the trade union movement and of the Labour Party and says to them, well, gentlemen, the government could fall tomorrow, this is a crisis, are you ready to take power? And they wind down the general strike. And really, it's nice to hear Rosa Luxemburg getting some praise. I think the mass strike is a really interesting and good piece of work in many ways. It was subjected to a lot of Stalinist calumny for sort of being syndicalist or overly reliant on spontaneity. And I think what she's trying to do is, within the framework of the Social Democratic Party as it existed then, counterpose something to the bureaucratism that existed and the reformism, the Bernsteinism. On the other hand, there's something to be said for advocating a theory of the working class taking power as actors in their own right, which is one of the things to respect about syndicalism. Some of the best American communists and French communists were won out of the French syndicalist movement or the IWW. But a part of their being won out of it was being won to the party conception, really by the experience of the October Revolution and realizing that you need a revolutionary vanguard party. The German experience is in some ways, as much as I see Rosa Luxemburg in the revolutionary Marxist tradition, the flip side of that the split happened so late that the German Revolution fails, that the communists did not break from the social democracy as early as, say, 1903, when the fissure starts developing in the Russian Revolution, and therefore there isn't sufficient time to prepare. Why does that happen? Because she's trying to solve things within the framework of the party of the whole class. So what I want to pose to the panelists as a question is, do you think that a socialist movement today that purports to be a party of the whole class can actually lead to human liberation?
Okay, since we have the impossible task of wrapping this up in 3 minutes, which is not going to happen, but could I ask you to answer those questions, whichever you'd like to answer, and include some concluding remarks? Thank you. Who would like to start? Jason?
Just a couple of things. In terms of, is our society pointing towards socialism? As soon as that question was asked, someone started talking about information technology. The productive forces of capitalist society have developed to such a degree that, yes, socialism, I think, in terms of its technical feasibility, is on the agenda and has been on the agenda for a rather long time. And modern information technology would make democratic socialist planning much easier than it ever was before. It's a matter of political circumstances and political will that are our current dilemma. And I just want to correct the IBT comment. The SPD was not supposed to be a party of the whole class. Certainly Kautsky and Bebel did not conceive of it as a party of the whole class. You can argue that it evolved into that, and that is certainly what happened, but that was not how it originated. In terms of concluding remarks, I feel like I've repeated myself probably more than enough this evening, but I do thank the Society for having me here. Thank you.
Is society pointing towards socialism? Objectively speaking, yes, absolutely. And I think we've had plenty of examples of what happens if that is further and further delayed, that transformation towards socialism. I guess 2 world wars and the possibility of the destruction of our planet are pretty good reasons that indicate that socialism is pretty much on the agenda, apart from what Jason already said. So, objectively, yes. So what is missing? Guess what I'm going to say? It's that subjective factor, which can be nothing else but the party of the proletariat. That is what is missing. And that is what has been missing for a long, long time, which is why we're looking at a history that is a history of defeat for the working class to a large extent, which also breeds a lot of pessimism and a fear of trying what apparently has gone wrong or was not successful before. I recognize those feelings and those thoughts and those concepts, but you know what? They are not very useful. I repeat, the only question that we need to solve is the question of how to lead the working class. That is the biggest problem we have. To forge a party that wins the confidence and the allegiance of the working class through proven leadership and proven minimal and big successes. That will offer a way out towards socialism, towards a socialist revolution. That's the only way.
Thank you. Brian?
I think at every period of history there are tendencies towards socialism and there are tendencies toward reaction, and that's no less true right now. In response to the question about the industrialization, I think it's one of the important things that the left tends to forget is the fundamental adaptability of capitalism as a system. Capitalism, as we know it today, is qualitatively different than it's been at previous stages, and I think the questioner is correct that in many ways it's co-opted many of the desires of people for at least the feeling of more control, more flexibility, less authoritarian dominance over their lives. I think most people deep down realize that the capitalist attempts to do those things are completely false, are completely illusory. At the same time, people get lost in the spectacle, to use a phrase from many decades ago, and the spectacle is that much more dazzling now than it's ever been. I think as much as we can't continue to be fighting against capitalism's past crises, but realistically face the present one, we need different organizational models. I think the traditional political party model that most of the left has adopted has clearly been a failure. I think the notion that the ruling class wants us or any other particular political tendency to lead it is a false hope. I think the working class and the mobilized people as a whole from many sectors of society, because again, the work in the age of deindustrialization, the traditional working class doesn't have the same power to shut down capitalism that it once had, and we need a much broader, much more holistic, and much more empowered from below movement of movements that's able to attain the level of self-consciousness that can get us to a qualitatively different place.
Yeah, I think socialism, technologically, economically, historically, is certainly on the agenda in terms of objective criteria. So then it comes to the subjective question, the party. And I agree, we need a party. And I agree that we don't need a party that tries to represent everyone. We don't need a party of the whole class. But if I can quote Lenin, we need a party of a new type. And that doesn't necessarily mean we need the so-called classic Leninist party, of which we have probably several hundred in the United States alone. We need to find a party that can somehow overcome this gulf between trying to represent everyone, trying to be all things to all people, and parties that are so narrow and so self-contained that they cannot draw in the masses needed to actually be a vanguard or be a stimulator. We need a party that tries to get the working class to emancipate themselves. Now, I don't have any clear answer on how this would be done, but we have to think beyond, putting, old wine in new bottles, and have to try to find a party that, as Lenin did when he had faced this problem, that suits the circumstances of our times, right? And that suits the culture of our times, and that actually can have an impact in a way that a mass electoral social democratic party couldn't, and likewise, neither could a sectarian, we have all the answers, read this brochure on the genesis of capitalism, and, it's not going to reach the masses that way. Thank you.
Round of applause for our
For the audience.